Well, here we go again. This time we're going to put braided lines on a Yamaha R1. If you're thinking about doing this, man, the results after you put braided lines on a motorcycle are just absolutely amazing. You can tell the difference. So I say do it. It only costs you about, give or take, 130, 140 bucks for braided lines front and rear. So here we go. The first thing we're going to do is remove the cap off the brake reservoir. That color of the fluid, that color of a nasty tea brown, that is the wrong color for brake fluid. I use brake fluid as a good example when I'm buying a bike. If I'm buying a motorcycle and someone looks me in the eye and tells me, oh yeah, this bike has been serviced, I take really good care of this bike, all the fluids have been done and it's kept up to date. I pretty much know the condition of the bike before I pick the bike up just from the pictures. The first thing I look at is the color of the brake fluid, the color of the clutch fluid. If it's brown like that, then I guarantee 100% that the bike has not been maintained. So you see my Mighty Vac right there, and I'm pumping brake fluid out of the system. So when we're going to put our brake lines on, it's best to go ahead and evacuate the entire system of all the brake fluid. But that brown crap that's sloshing around in my Mighty Vac tells me that this 2007 R1 has never had the brake fluid replaced. So rule of thumb, when you're out shopping for a motorcycle, you're looking at motorcycles online and they tell you that the bike's been serviced. If the brake fluid is dark brown, it's not a golden yellow color, then that bike probably has not been maintained as satisfactorily as you would hope. It's not really that big of a deal. It's just something that you're going to need to address once you buy the bike, and I would say take care of it before you start riding. Right now I'm loosening the front brake lever. I'm just loosening the bolts that hold the cap on, that clamp the brake lever to the handlebar, to the clip-on, and now I have a 6mm socket on the banjo bolt, and once you break that banjo bolt free, it's a good idea to get yourself a paper towel in your hand. It will start leaking on you. You do not want this brake fluid to leak anywhere on the bike, on any paint, on any kind of surface whatsoever. Brake fluid is as bad as acid, and it will just destroy a bike's finish. So make sure you protect the bike not to get any brake fluid on it. This bike, it's like to near impossible to get to this banjo bolt itself. So if you do decide after watching this video that you want to put braided brake lines on your R1, and I mean, take it from me, do it. Do it, do it, do it, do it, do it. It's cheap. It's a great upgrade for your brakes. Braided brake lines and EBC HH brake pads, your R1 will be the best stopping machine on the road. But anyway, removing this banjo bolt and getting it out of the way, putting it back together is even more difficult than taking it apart. But when you're doing this job, go ahead and take your fairings off and take your upper off with your headlight and all that. It makes it a lot easier to install this. I'm really not that sure you'd be able to put braided brake lines on this bike without removing the headlight assembly. So just keep that in mind. It's going to add an extra hour. You know, what's an hour? It's not a bad idea to spend some time with your bike once in a while anyway. So now we're over on the left hand side. Again, we're just removing the banjo bolts from the calipers. We did the right side. Here's the left side. As you're removing these banjo bolts, any residual fluid left in the line is coming out. So make sure you have a paper towel handy so you can catch any of that brake fluid flying out. So here's your new braided brake lines. Put the one that's angled down the most on first, and on your banjo bolt it's going to be crush washer, banjo, crush washer, and then other banjo. So the one with the most of a bend is going to go on first, and it's going to be at the bottom. That way it's kind of bent out of the way. Great idea to go ahead and install the banjo bolt, and only install it loose. You don't want to torque it down just yet. Galfer says the torque spec for their brake lines is 12 to 17 foot-pounds. So that's more than enough to crush those copper washers and get a seal. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just going to get this bolt just snug enough that my braided lines will move. You don't want to tighten them down yet because you want to be able to move these lines, and braided lines aren't like those rubber DOT lines that we just took off. Braided lines don't have any kind of give. And when you have this kit, you can kind of see on the line up by the master cylinder, there are some paper tags, and they're going to tell you which one's your left side, which one's your right side, and it tells you that that's the end that needs to be up by the master. So here we go with the banjo bolt, and again it's going to be banjo bolt, crush washer, banjo, crush washer, and then you're going to screw it into the caliper. Never reuse a crush washer. And I say that lightly because if it's like a crush washer for your oil drain plug, sure, you can get 5, 10, 15 uses out of that as long as it's not leaking oil. But never reuse a crush washer for your brake system. You're not going to die because your oil dripped out of your drain plug on your motorcycle. But if your brakes fail to work as you're going 100 miles an hour into a turn, life's not going to be good. So, you know, a crush washer is only about 10 cents a piece. So if you take your brake system apart, go ahead and replace those crush washers anytime that you take your brake lines off. Make sure you're putting on new crush washers. So right now we're just lining up the new brake line with the little clamp, and this clamp comes with the kit that allows you to clamp the brake line to your fender. On this particular bike, I have the OEM bolt for the bike. The other side I don't, so when you watch me put the other side on, I'm just going to use a 8mm bolt, little shiny metal looking bolt, but it's absolutely a Honda bolt that I'm using on this Yamaha. But the Yamaha is operating fine with that Honda bolt on it. Nothing bad is going to happen to this Yamaha because it has one Honda bolt on it. So once you get this a little bit tight, you'll know where your brake line needs to be. There are instructions that come with this kit. It's got some pretty good pictures. But again, you want to make sure that your line is in place, and then put your little clamp on, and then come back and tighten down your banjo bolt last. So the last thing you want to do is tighten down that banjo bolt. Again, it's only 12 to 17 foot-pounds. That's not a whole lot of foot-pounds. It's not a lot of torque. For that little bit of torque, you really don't need a torque wrench. If you're just using a combination wrench, chances of you putting more than 17 foot-pounds of torque on a 14mm combination wrench is probably not going to happen. You're going to have to be bigger and more muscular than me if you're going to pull that one off. And as you can see, getting the braided line and the banjo bolt lined up with that hole in the caliper, sometimes it is just impossible to do. But be gentle. You know, don't manhandle that banjo bolt. Whatever you do, do not put a wrench on that banjo bolt and try to thread it into the caliper with the wrench. Use your fingers. Get it started with your fingers. Your caliper is only, you know, just shitty aluminum. So whatever you do, you know, tighten it up later with the wrench, but get the banjo bolt started into the caliper with your fingers, because you do not want to be destroying that caliper and having to jump on eBay to buy a new one. Just doesn't make sense, especially on like this bike. This is an 07 R1. This is January of 2020. A 2007 R1 is only worth about $4,000 on a good day. Typically, I would expect to pay about $3,500 for a 2007, 2008 R1. For just a few $1,000s more, you can get an 09 or a 10, which is a lot better R1 than this. So yeah, just do everything you can to save as much money while you're repairing your bike, because bikes, especially metric bikes, do not hold their value like you think they hold their value. The only reason you think your R1's worth any money is because it's your R1. When you get ready to sell it, you're going to find out that your bike is not worth what you think it's worth anyway. I have a close friend who's trying to sell a 2010 R1 right now. It's his pride and joy. It's a beautiful bike, but he's probably not going to see $7 grand for it in the spring when he gets it sold, if he gets it sold. But now we got the clamp on the left side cinched down to the bike, and as you can see, that was an 8mm bolt that I used on that. So the kit also comes with 2 zip ties. So these zip ties just go where the 2 lines go between the forks, and it just keeps the lines together, and then makes sure that the brake lines stay together as you're turning the handlebars from left to right and right to left. Always make sure that your banjo bolts are tightened down, and then we're going to finish tightening down the banjo bolts up on the brake lever in the master cylinder. So very important, when you're doing this, make sure you pull the brake lines away from the fork tube. So I'm putting my hand behind the brake lines, between the brake lines and the fork tubes, to tighten it down. That's going to give me about 1 inch. So with this inch, it's going to allow me to adjust that brake lever up and down. I don't know if you've ever ridden a motorcycle where the brake lever is too high. The transition going from the throttle, from your fingers going from the throttle to a brake lever which is too high, is like to near impossible, and it's a good way for you to crash. So it's better to have your brake lever a little bit lower, so you can just roll the throttle forward to close it and grab a handful of brake at the same time. So this looks pretty good right there. It feels good to me, so I'm pretty sure this bike will be safe once it hits the highway. So right now I'm topping off the reservoir with a bottle of .4. So I just ignored the full line and I just filled it up to the top, because I'm going to drain this at least 3 times. Remember how dark it was at the beginning of the video. There's still going to be some dark fluid coming out, so I want to make sure that I get enough fluid through the system, that I have fresh brake fluid in my calipers. So here we go. I've got my Mighty Vac hooked up to the bleeder valve. I've got my 8mm socket on there, my 8mm combination wrench, and I just break it free and start pumping. While I'm pumping, I'm watching my reservoir, and as my reservoir gets down to the low fluid level, that's where I want to stop. So right now I'm pretty much just sucking air, and you'll start seeing brake fluid while you're doing this yourself. You'll see it start sputtering into the little catch canister, and then once that happens, you can tighten it down. So this will be my first bleed on the left side. I was always taught to bleed the farthest from the master first and then the closest to the master. So I did my left side first. Now I'm going to do my right side. Same thing, I'm just going to bleed it once. I just want to get all the air out of my lines. I want to get fluid flowing through the caliper. That way I know it's coming down from the master, coming down the brake line. I have fresh fluid in the caliper. And then once I get my right side done, then I'm going to move up to the bleeder valve on my master. Now if you're watching this video and you don't have an R1, or you don't have a, I'm going to offend some people, but a real sport bike, then you're not going to have the third bleeder valve up on the master cylinder. So I'm going to show you what we're talking about right now. So right here I'm peeling the rubber cap off of the master cylinder bleeder valve, and if I were to squeeze the brake lever right now, I wouldn't have a whole lot of brake feel, just because there's air all in this master cylinder. So if you just have like a CBR 600, or I would say like a CBR 650, or some bike like that, just a generic 600, you're probably not going to have this bleeder valve up at the master. The cheaper sport bikes, they don't seem to spend the money on a decent master like the leader class sport bikes. So right now I'm just going to pump the reservoir down to the low level. So this master is pretty well bled right now. If I grabbed a handful of brakes right now, there's nothing but brakes in that brake lever. So that is a good thing. So now I'm going to finish up. I'm going to pull some fluid through this side. And at this point I really don't need to pull more fluid through. But I do like to just to make sure that I do have all the air out of the line, all the craps out of the line. You see that the color of the fluid in my Mighty Vac is a dark color. It's almost a brown color. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now, is just getting more of the discolored brake fluid out of the system and any air that might be in the system. But more or less I just want to flush out as much of the old fluid that might be left in that caliper. I want to get it out. It's just better when you have a bike that's this old, that's never had fresh brake fluid. It's just better to have new fluid going through the whole system and as much of that old stuff out as possible. So again, this R1, it took .4. If you're just watching this video to learn how to put braided lines on, it's a great idea to look at the filler cap on your reservoir, on your brake fluid reservoir. It will tell you whether you have .4, .3. Sometimes they have mineral oil. Usually it's clutches that have mineral oil. But go with whatever is printed on top of that reservoir cap, or in your owner's manual. Don't go from a video that you saw on the interwebs. Make sure when you're done, you put those rubber dust caps over all of your bleeder valves. Make sure there's no drips of brake fluid anywhere on the bike. go ahead and top off your reservoir to right at the full level, and then we're going to put your diaphragm in, your little retainer, and then the cap is going to go back on to your reservoir. And then once you get your cap tightened back down, take your Phillips screwdriver and tighten down that little screw that holds the cap lock in place. And that's pretty much as easy as it is to put braided brake lines on pretty much every motorcycle. So I hope this video helps you out. Please watch some of my other ones.